World War II was not just a chapter in history books. It was a storm that swept across continents, leaving behind destruction on a scale humanity had never witnessed before. Between 1939 and 1945, the world lost an estimated 70 to 85 million lives. Imagine that for a moment. Entire cities reduced to ashes, families torn apart, nations reshaped forever. Among the great powers that fueled this storm was Japan, a nation that, in the early 20th century, had risen from isolation to become an empire stretching across Asia and the Pacific. Its soldiers marched through China, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific Islands, leaving behind both triumphs and tragedies that still haunt history. And at the heart of this empire stood one man, Emperor Hirohito. Born in 1901, Hirohito would go on to become the longest reigning monarch in Japanese history, ruling for more than 60 years. But when we speak of Hirohito, a question inevitably rises. Who was he during the war? Was he the divine, untouchable figure that many Japanese believed him to be, a passive symbol while generals made the real decisions? Or was he quietly steering the ship of war from behind the curtains, his hand guiding Japan toward conquest? This is where the mystery begins. On paper, the Emperor of Japan was not a mere figurehead. The Meiji Constitution gave him supreme command over the army and the navy. His authority, at least legally, was absolute. Yet the Japan of the 1930s and 1940s was a nation consumed by militarism, where generals and admirals often acted first and explained later. Some historians argue Hirohito was sidelined, a captive of his own war machine. Others insist he was fully aware, signing off on decisions that would plunge Asia, and eventually the United States, into devastating conflict. Think about it. Could an emperor, revered almost as a god, truly be unaware of the attacks carried out in his name? Could Hirohito not have intervened when atrocities like the Nanjing massacre reached his palace walls? Or was his silence not ignorance but complicity? And then comes the silence after the war. Japan lay in ruins, 2 of its cities annihilated by atomic bombs. For the first time in history, the Japanese people heard their emperor's voice as he announced surrender in 1945. Yet, he spoke in vague, poetic language, never admitting defeat outright, never accepting direct responsibility. After that, Hirohito never publicly reflected on his role in the war. He lived on for decades, transformed into a constitutional monarch, smiling gently at public events, while the world debated what he had truly known and what he had chosen to keep hidden. So we're left with a haunting question. Was Emperor Hirohito a powerless bystander swept away by history, or was he one of its architects, silently shaping the fate of millions? His silence, carefully preserved until his death in 1989, leaves us only with fragments, contradictions, and mystery. And perhaps that is why Hirohito's story still matters today, because it forces us to ask, when leaders choose silence in times of crisis, is that neutrality, or is it responsibility? Before the chaos of World War II, before the bombs and the devastation, Japan stood as an empire unlike any other. And at the center of this empire was not a general, not a politician, but a man the Japanese people believed to be divine. Emperor Hirohito. In Japanese tradition, the emperor wasn't just a ruler. He was a descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu. Imagine that for a moment. To the people of Japan, Hirohito wasn't merely a monarch. He was living proof of heaven's connection to earth. His presence wasn't political. It was sacred. Every bow, every ceremony, every public appearance carried with it the weight of divine approval. And when you hold that kind of symbolic power, even silence can feel like a command. But Japan in the early 20th century wasn't just built on myth and reverence. It was built on a constitution. Under the Meiji Constitution of 1889, the emperor wasn't just a figure on a throne. Article 11 made it clear. The emperor has supreme command of the army and navy. On paper, Hirohito wasn't a distant observer. He was the supreme commander, the ultimate authority behind the world's most disciplined military machine. And yet, reality was more complicated. Think about this. When you're treated like a god, does that mean you actually control everything? Or does it mean others act in your name while you remain untouchable? In practice, Hirohito's power was filtered, shaped by layers of advisors, military chiefs, and political elites who surrounded him. They drafted policies, orchestrated strategies, and presented him with decisions that, more often than not, he was expected to approve. Still, here lies the paradox. Even if Hirohito wasn't dictating every battle plan, his authority was the foundation on which the entire system rested. Every soldier who marched, every general who commanded, did so with the understanding that they served the emperor. His silence was never neutral, it was endorsement. His signature wasn't just ink, it was destiny for millions. So the question becomes, was Hirohito trapped within a system of militarists too powerful to resist? Or was the system itself powered by his divine image, his constitutional authority, and the belief that he was more than a man? This tension between symbol and commander, between godlike reverence and political reality, defines Hirohito's position before the war. To the world outside Japan, he may have looked like a quiet monarch hidden behind palace walls. But inside Japan, his very existence shaped the nation's path. Whether or not he pulled the strings directly, the entire stage was lit by his presence. And that is where the story truly begins. Because once war broke out, this blurred line between sacred symbol and supreme commander would become one of the greatest mysteries of the 20th century. The story of Japan's march to war didn't happen overnight. It was not a single decision, but a chain of moments, each one pulling the nation deeper into conflict. And at the center of those moments was Emperor Hirohito. His actions, his silence, and even his hesitations shaped the destiny of millions. Let's begin in 1931, in a region called Manchuria. Japan's Kwantung Army, stationed in northeast China, decided to act on its own. Without approval from Tokyo, they staged the infamous Mukden incident, blowing up a section of railway and blaming it on Chinese forces. It was a manufactured excuse to invade, and invade they did. Now here's the critical part. Emperor Hirohito was not pleased. Records suggest he initially expressed concern, frustrated that the army had acted independently. But then came the turning point. Instead of punishing the generals, Hirohito legitimized their conquest. He gave the invasion the imperial seal of approval, and in doing so, he set a precedent. Rogue military actions could be forgiven, even rewarded, if they expanded Japan's empire. Imagine the signal that sent. When the man seen as divine accepted it, who could stand in the way? Just 6 years later, Japan was once again at war, this time on a massive scale. In 1937, Japanese forces clashed with Chinese troops near Beijing. What began as a skirmish spiraled into the Second Sino-Japanese War, a brutal conflict that would last until the end of World War II. This war was unlike anything Japan had faced before. Cities burned, millions of Chinese civilians were caught in the crossfire, and some of the darkest chapters of the century unfolded. One of them was the Nanjing Massacre. Over the course of 6 weeks, Japanese soldiers slaughtered tens of thousands. Some estimates say up to 300,000 people. Women were assaulted, families destroyed, humanity itself trampled under boots. And here lies the uncomfortable question. What did Hirohito know? Reports of atrocities reached the throne. He received detailed updates about the campaigns. Some historians argue that Hirohito not only knew, but also approved continued military operations, even after civilian casualties mounted. Others say he was powerless, swept along by a military machine too large to control. But if the emperor, believed to hold supreme command, didn't stop it, was silence itself a form of consent? By the late 1930s, Japan had become locked in a dangerous mindset. Expansion was survival. The military believed Japan needed resources, territory, and dominance in Asia to compete with Western powers. And Hirohito was there at every imperial conference, listening, nodding, occasionally raising questions, but ultimately giving the imperial sanction needed for each decision. Then came the moment that would forever change world history. Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. The Japanese military planned a bold strike against the United States, aiming to cripple its Pacific fleet before America could threaten Japan's empire. We know from surviving records that Hirohito attended the conferences where war against the United States was discussed. The generals argued fiercely in favor of aggression. They saw war as inevitable, a matter of striking first or being strangled by American sanctions. Hirohito listened. He asked questions. He hesitated. But in the end, he signed off. His approval gave legitimacy to one of the most daring and devastating surprise attacks in modern history. Pearl Harbor wasn't just a military operation. It was the moment Japan crossed a line it could never return from. In just 2 hours, battleships burned, aircraft were destroyed, and more than 2,000 American lives were lost. The United States, once divided over whether to enter the war, was suddenly united in fury. And at the very center of that decision sat Emperor Hirohito. So how do we judge him? Was he a reluctant monarch, pressured by militarists who dragged Japan into chaos? Or was he an active participant, whose signature was the final word that unleashed war across the Pacific? It's a haunting paradox. On one hand, Hirohito sometimes expressed concern, sometimes asked questions. On the other, he consistently legitimized aggression when it mattered most. Manchuria, China, Pearl Harbor. Again and again, his decisions, or his silences, opened the gates to destruction. And as history shows, once those gates were opened, there was no closing them. Japan's road to war was now unstoppable. And Hirohito, whether as a passive witness or an active commander, had become inseparable from the path his nation had chosen. As the Pacific War raged on, Japan's empire stretched from the jungles of Southeast Asia to the islands of the Pacific. The Japanese people were told they were fighting for survival, for honor, and most importantly, for their emperor. And Emperor Hirohito became more than just a man. He became the symbol of Japan's unity in the darkest of times. We often picture Hirohito as distant, hidden behind palace walls. But during the war, his image was everywhere. He appeared in public wearing military uniform, not the robes of a ceremonial monarch. That uniform mattered. It made him look like a soldier, standing alongside his people in their struggle. Every photograph, every newsreel, every shrine visit reminded the Japanese that this wasn't just a political war. It was a sacred mission. His very presence gave legitimacy to Japan's expansion across Asia. When Japanese troops marched into Singapore, or when they planted their flag on Pacific Islands, they did so under the banner of a divine emperor. But here's where the story gets complicated. How much did Hirohito really know about the war being fought in his name? Some would say he was only a figurehead, a man carried along by the tidal wave of militarism. Yet diaries from court officials and records of imperial conferences tell a different story. They suggest Hirohito was regularly briefed about Japan's military operations. He listened to reports of victories and defeats. He heard about shortages of food and weapons, and yes, he likely knew about the suffering his people endured. In fact, evidence shows that Hirohito sometimes went beyond listening, he intervened. One striking example comes from 1945, when Japan was already facing devastating losses. American bombers were reducing entire cities to rubble. The Navy, once the pride of the empire, was shattered. In these desperate final months, Hirohito reportedly gave orders to halt certain operations that were draining resources and costing countless lives. That may not sound like much, but think about it. In a system where generals were expected to command and the emperor to remain above politics, the fact that Hirohito stepped in at all shows his influence was real. So, was Hirohito just a sacred mascot, paraded before the people to maintain morale? Or was he a cautious strategist, quietly shaping the war from behind the curtain? The truth lies somewhere in between. On the one hand, Hirohito's image was carefully controlled. He was shown as calm, divine, untouched by the hardships of ordinary life. That image kept the nation united, even as rice rations shrank and families mourned loved ones who never came home. On the other hand, behind palace walls, he was a man reading reports, discussing tactics, and occasionally making decisions that affected the battlefield. This dual role, both godlike symbol and informed participant, makes Hirohito one of the most enigmatic figures of World War II. Was his intervention in 1945 an act of compassion, trying to save what was left of Japan, or was it simply a practical choice, the last move of a leader trying to preserve his empire's dignity in defeat? And here's the question that lingers. If Hirohito had that kind of authority in 1945, did he also have the power earlier in the war? When atrocities were committed, when expansion was at its peak, could he have stopped the march into Southeast Asia, or the relentless fight for Pacific Islands? Or did he choose silence because silence kept the myth alive, that he was above human responsibility, even as the world burned around him? What makes Hirohito's story so fascinating is not just what he did, but what he represented. To the Japanese people, his uniform and his speeches embodied their struggle. To the outside world, his silence raised suspicion. Was he powerless? Or was he simply hiding in plain sight? By 1945, the facade of invincibility was cracking. Cities like Tokyo and Osaka were devastated by firebombing raids. Millions of civilians were displaced. Even the sacred image of the emperor could not shield Japan from reality. And in that crumbling moment, Hirohito revealed a side of himself few had seen before. a monarch who, for the first time, dared to step out of the shadows and nudge the course of the war. This tension between symbol and actor, silence and command, would follow Hirohito until the end of his life. It leaves us with questions we still wrestle with today. Was he complicit? Was he cautious? Or was he something in between, a man trapped by the very divinity that gave him power? The Pacific War made Hirohito more than a monarch. It made him the face of a nation at war, and it set the stage for his most controversial moment yet. The decision in 1945 to surrender and speak directly to his people for the very first time. By the summer of 1945, Japan was cornered. Cities were in ruins from relentless bombing raids, the military was stretched thin, and the once mighty empire was teetering on collapse. Yet even then, surrender was unthinkable. The idea of giving up went against everything the nation had been taught. Loyalty to the emperor, fight to the last man, death before dishonor. But then came two events that shattered all illusions. On August 6, 1945, the United States dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima. In a flash of light brighter than the sun, the city was leveled. Tens of thousands were killed instantly, and in the days that followed, radiation claimed even more lives. Just 3 days later, on August 9th, a second bomb fell on Nagasaki, bringing the death toll of both attacks to over 200,000 men, women, and children. Entire generations vanished in seconds, and if that wasn't devastating enough, another blow came on August 8th. The Soviet Union declared war on Japan. For years, Tokyo had quietly hoped Moscow might serve as a mediator with the Allies. Instead, the Red Army stormed into Japanese-held Manchuria with overwhelming force. Suddenly, Japan was being crushed from every side, by fire, by radiation, by sheer numbers. For Emperor Hirohito, this was the breaking point. For most of the war, he had followed tradition, remaining distant, hidden behind layers of generals and ministers. But now, as his country faced annihilation, Hirohito did something no Japanese emperor had ever done before. He stepped forward and made the decision to surrender. On August 15, 1945, the Japanese people heard their emperor's voice for the very first time. Radios across the nation broadcast his speech, known as the Gyokuon Hoso, the dual voice broadcast. Imagine the moment. Millions huddled in silence, straining to catch his words through static. His voice was formal, almost distant, using archaic court language that many common people could barely understand. He never once used the word defeat. Instead, he spoke of enduring the unbearable, of laying down arms for the sake of peace. But make no mistake, the meaning was clear. Japan had surrendered. The empire that had fought so fiercely, that had vowed never to yield, was now bowing to reality. The war was over, and yet Hirohito's speech raised as many questions as it answered. Why avoid the word defeat? Why speak so vaguely at such a crucial moment? Some say he wanted to protect the dignity of Japan, to soften the shock for a people raised to believe they could never lose. Others argue it was another example of Hirohito's silence, his tendency to step just far enough forward to shape history, but never far enough to claim full responsibility. Still, his voice that day changed everything. For the first time, the divine emperor became a human presence, one whose words meant life instead of death. In that moment, Hirohito may have saved millions more lives by stopping the war, but he also left behind a lingering mystery. Was this the act of a reluctant leader forced into a corner, or the final move of a man who always understood his true power? When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, Japan was not just defeated, it was shattered. Cities lay in ruins, millions were homeless, and the nation's once mighty empire had evaporated overnight. But even in that chaos, one figure remained standing at the center of it all: Emperor Hirohito. And what happened next would shape not only Japan's future, but also how history remembers him. After surrender, Japan came under American occupation, led by General Douglas MacArthur. Now here's where the story takes a fascinating turn. Many of Japan's top generals and ministers were tried for war crimes, some even executed. Yet Hirohito, whose name had been tied to every military action, was spared. Why? MacArthur made a calculated decision. He believed that putting Hirohito on trial would plunge Japan into deeper turmoil. The emperor, after all, wasn't just a man to his people. He was still seen as sacred, a living link to the divine. Stripping him away might have unraveled the fragile fabric of Japanese society. So, instead of holding Hirohito accountable, MacArthur shielded him. The blame was placed squarely on the shoulders of military leaders, while the emperor was recast as a figure of stability, a symbol who could help rebuild a broken nation. And from that moment, Hirohito began a new role. No longer the supreme commander, he became the quiet monarch of a pacifist Japan. His image shifted from that of a wartime leader in uniform to a gentle, almost grandfatherly figure, smiling at schoolchildren, visiting disaster sites, and speaking softly of peace. But behind that transformation was something more troubling, a carefully maintained silence. Throughout the rest of his life, Hirohito never once publicly admitted responsibility for Japan's wartime decisions. He never acknowledged the suffering caused in his name. Instead, the narrative put forth was that he had been a peace-loving figure, manipulated or pressured by his generals into war. It was a convenient story, one that allowed Japan to move forward without tearing itself apart, but also one that left a shadow hanging over history. And that brings us to the great debate. Historians remain deeply divided over Hirohito's role. Revisionists argue that he was far more active than the post-war image suggests. They point to diaries of court officials, records of imperial conferences, and his occasional wartime interventions as evidence that he was not a passive observer, but a leader making calculated choices. On the other hand, defenders claim Hirohito had little real control over the militarists who dominated his government. They see him as a cautious man caught in an impossible situation, trapped between tradition, politics, and the momentum of a war machine too powerful for even an emperor to stop. So who was the real Hirohito? Was he the mastermind hiding in plain sight, carefully navigating Japan's empire through aggression and war? Or was he a prisoner of his own throne, powerless to stop the tide of militarism that carried his nation into disaster? The truth is, we may never fully know. The post-war silence, his silence, ensured that many questions went unanswered. And perhaps that was the point. By saying little, Hirohito allowed people to see him however they wanted. A guilty leader to some, an innocent figurehead to others. What we do know is this: his decision not to speak shaped how generations have remembered him. To some, he remains a symbol of peace who helped Japan transition into a new era. To others, his silence is the loudest evidence of all, that he bore responsibility but chose never to admit it. Even today, decades after his death in 1989, Hirohito's legacy divides historians, and maybe that's why his story continues to fascinate, because it forces us to ask a question that goes beyond Japan, beyond World War II. When leaders stay silent in moments of crisis, is that neutrality? Or is it complicity? So where does this leave us? When we look at Emperor Hirohito's role in World War II, we don't find clear black and white answers. Instead, we find shades of grey. On paper, Hirohito stood as the supreme commander of Japan's armed forces, the man with absolute military authority under the Meiji Constitution. His position was unlike that of any other leader. He wasn't just a head of state. He was seen as divine, the very embodiment of Japan's destiny. And yet, in practice, the picture looks different. He was surrounded by ambitious generals, admirals, and politicians who often drove the nation forward with their own agendas. Hirohito was constrained, sometimes hesitant, but never entirely powerless. His choices, whether spoken or silent, still carried immense weight. His most decisive moment came at the very end. In August 1945, after Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and the Soviet invasion, Hirohito broke centuries of imperial tradition and directly intervened. He chose surrender. That decision, painful as it was, likely saved millions of lives, both Japanese and Allied. Without it, Japan might have fought on, leading to an invasion that would have cost far more blood and suffering. For that moment alone, some see him as a leader who ultimately chose peace when it mattered most. But here's the paradox. After the war, Hirohito never explained himself. He never admitted guilt, never acknowledged responsibility, never spoke openly about what he knew and when he knew it. Instead, he allowed a narrative to take shape, that he was a peace-loving emperor dragged into war by militarists, a passive symbol forced to stand by while others acted in his name. Was that the truth, or was it convenient silence? And that's the heart of Hirohito's legacy. To some, he was complicit, a leader who had the authority to stop aggression, but chose to approve or remain quiet. To others, He was cautious, trapped by history, doing what little he could in a system spiraling out of control. The debate continues because Hirohito himself left us no answers. Perhaps that's why his story still resonates. It reminds us that history isn't always about bold speeches or dramatic acts. It's also about the silences, the things left unsaid. Sometimes silence protects, sometimes it conceals, and sometimes it becomes the loudest statement of all. So we're left with the enduring mystery of Hirohito. Not only what he did, but what he chose never to say. And maybe that's the lesson for us today. When leaders face moments of crisis, silence is never neutral. It can be as powerful, as destructive, and as defining as any action. Hirohito's reign spanned both the darkest and the most transformative chapters of modern Japan. His role in World War II will always be debated, but what cannot be denied is this: his choices and his silence changed the course of history.